Influence is an interesting thing to reflect back on. I grew up on a farm in the Western District. My dad was a farmer. We grew sheep and cattle occasionally, but no crops. And he was very interested in science and had a good relationship with the local agricultural research institute. And my work experience job was actually working there. In fact, I spent 2 weeks washing grass. Fantastic experience. But that really stimulated an interest in science, and both my parents were interested in knowledge for knowledge's sake. So I think that gave me something to aim for, that I would understand more about science, and in the end I went to university to study agricultural science.
In terms of what I do, forensic science, I don't have that much interest in the causes of it, but the main thing that's driven where I've worked and what I've done is my love of travel. I adore going all over the world and seeing different cultures and learning about different cultures. And with forensic science you can travel everywhere because every country and every city has a forensics lab. So I moved from New Zealand to Australia to do my PhD. Coming to Melbourne, never having been here before, and just packed up my life and came here. I did the same thing to move to the Netherlands to do my postdoctoral research, and I've been fortunate enough to attend conferences all over the world, throughout Europe, America, Africa, on the topic of forensic science. So I get to combine my love of travel and my scientific career in one.
Well, I've been a zoologist now for 31 years, but I track it back to a primary school prep grade teacher who took us on nature walks and knew what she was looking at and showed us around. But I also had the privilege of growing up with a couple of local naturalists, Ellen McCulloch, and the McCubbins used to live opposite us, and one of those McCubbins was Charlie McCubbin, who was a wildlife artist and naturalist, and they just triggered a curiosity in nature that's continued ever since. Two people come to mind for the mentor and the collaborators, and they're different. When I was growing up as a teenager, there was a zoologist in the church I went to, a guy called David Young, and David was an evolutionary biologist and also a person who thought deeply about theology as well. So he had an influence on my life, and then later in my life I've had the privilege of working with a number of scientists, but one at the moment who's particularly significant is a colleague, Professor Andrew Bennett from Deakin University, and the joy of that collaboration is we have really complementary skills and yet a common curiosity about ecology and a common set of values of how we look at the world, I guess. And so it's just been a joy and a privilege to work with people who have different skills to my own, and we can do things that apart we couldn't do.
As a young scientist, I'm still kind of on my second postdoc. What I do is largely driven by my mentors. Particularly when I did my first postdoc, I moved to the Netherlands and was fortunate enough to work under Professor Kaiser from Germany, who pioneered the use of the Y chromosome for forensic science. And coincidentally, he needed someone to work on it with him just when I started. So he was looking for someone to take over his role as the kind of foremost expert in the Y chromosome. And so that's the role I've picked up from him, and through working with him every day and continuing my collaboration afterwards, I've now taken up the work of the Y chromosome and am able to implement new methods into forensic science all over the world through his influence on my research.
Mentors are really important in science training. It's hard to overestimate their effect. So when you talk to scientists, they'll talk about scientific families where a supervisor's training PhD student, that PhD student becomes a research scientist in their own right and then has their own group of trainees. And you can see the influence moving between, in fact, generations of scientists. My PhD was done at the University of Melbourne, and I guess I didn't think of myself as a scientist really until I was close to the end of it, which is a bit of an odd way to start off in a career. And when I came to La Trobe, I worked with Professor Bruce Stone, And that was a real revelation to me, because I had come from an agricultural background where I thought science should be pretty practical, and coming to work with Bruce really made me think about knowledge for knowledge's sake, and that taught me a great deal about how creative, I guess, science could be and how profoundly satisfying it could be. That's chance and luck are hard to separate from hard work, actually. So luck favours the prepared mind, I suppose, is what you'd say. It's always lucky to come across a system, an experimental system, which actually gives you an answer, because there's so many of them where you can't generate enough pertinent data to allow you to draw conclusions. So I'm going back a long way here, but my own PhD work was around how plants pack protein into seeds. The first experimental system I started working with was soybeans, well studied, and it's a major crop in the US. We got about a year in, and the work that I was doing essentially got gazumped by a group in the US who did a very good job, I might add. But then I moved to a more Australian crop. In Australia, lupins are grown for stock feed, and that opened a door to a whole lot of stuff, because lupins process proteins in quite a different way to more widely used legumes for human consumption. So why did I pick lupins? It was an Australian crop. It wasn't because we knew that there was going to be something exciting about it, but it turned out to be really interesting. So it was lucky that we picked them, but it wouldn't have been lucky unless we'd been looking for those kind of characteristics, I guess.
There is a really quite telling example of that in my own research, where I, for many years, studied the ecology and behaviour of birds. And then in 1995, my study site burnt down, and I lost all my colour-marked birds, which I've been looking at for about 7 years, and that study was abruptly stopped. But in the process, I was confronted by the fact that this was a prescribed burn that had escaped, that burnt my study site, and that started me on a whole trajectory for the last decade of studying fire ecology, which I hadn't been particularly interested in, but I was confronted with. And I have to say, looking back now, that's probably the area in which I've made the greatest contribution in my science. So call that serendipity. I got burnt, but it's benefited my work.
Chance is actually the reason I'm in forensics. I was originally working in evolutionary genetics, working on parakeet evolution, and by chance there was a flood in New Zealand and a skull washed up. And New Zealand police had no idea how to analyse it or how to find out who it was, and they happened to come to the university that I was working at because they knew we had techniques to analyse minute amounts of DNA. And so I spent some time finding out the ancestry of the skull, whether it was a Maori individual or a European. And that was my first exposure to human genetics and to forensic science at all. And that really got my interest up. Wow, this is amazing that we can use DNA to identify who a person is, where they're from. The fact we could trace the skull back to a Nantucket whaler from the 1800s just made me think this science is amazing, and I'm going to go and do this for the rest of my career. And it was purely chance that New Zealand police didn't know where else to turn. So that has influenced the rest of my life, basically. I think my gender makes me work a little bit harder. Within forensic science, it's still quite a police culture, so it's quite male-dominated. So as a female working in that area, you do feel a need to prove yourself and to perhaps put in more effort to make sure that they're seeing you as equal. Within general genetics and biological science, I think there's not as much of an issue in that regard. It's more the police culture is still heavily male-driven. Having a Kiwi accent gets laughs whenever I give talks in Australia, but otherwise it's pretty universal. I've worked with non-English speakers. I've gone and worked in Asian labs and European labs where they don't speak English, but you can communicate because the techniques are the same the world over. So that makes it fairly easy.
Yeah, I think more the culture, most definitely. I'm part of a Christian community locally in West Heidelberg which has a number of academics and particularly scientists within it, and we meet reasonably regularly and support one another in our careers and in our approaches to how we take our teaching and how we take our research. And so to have a group of people who share a common set of values in terms of making a difference of how the world's inhabited and how we use the planet's resources has been really significant to me. So that's a very big part of my life, and the way I approach my science is I guess, a reflection of my beliefs as a Christian and the way I work out what I put my energies into.
So I have 3 kids. The decision to stop work and have kids made a big difference and really changed the way I did science. I chose to become what was essentially a research fellow in somebody else's laboratory rather than running my own lab, and that was essentially a lifestyle choice. But I'm really, really glad I did, because I'm much happier working in a big collaborative team. I really enjoy bouncing off other people, and for me that was a great solution to both the family work-life balance disaster, as it usually is, and the desire to work as part of an intellectual team. So yes, gender there played a role for me that it might not have played for other people. The question of whether or not I would have gone down this path, I mean, I think because I really like collaborative work, I would have always chosen to work in a team anyway, but I think you can't escape from the influences of the world around you. So still, because I grew up on a farm and because I studied agriculture in the first place, that's still the first thing I think about when I think about applied science. So it stays with you all the way. In my area, which is biochemistry, there are a lot of people working, so there's a lot of self-correction happening anyway. That's not to say people don't make mistakes, of course they do, and there's lots of debate in the published literature, that is in journals, in papers in journals and in conferences, about when people say, that's not the finding that I have. You might say that in your system, but it doesn't apply to my system, therefore you can't generalise from it. So that happens quite a lot, but it tends to be self-correcting. So when others bring up examples where it doesn't apply, that helps refine the original premise or hypothesis so that you get a better idea of what the underlying truths are and whether they're transferable between systems. So I can't think of something directly related to my work where a major theory's been overturned, but lots of examples where things get refined, which is how science is supposed to work.
We haven't had major mistakes. I've had to publish one erratum to a paper where some figures we discovered after the paper had been published were incorrect, and we had to publish a correction and the correct figure. Basically, as soon as we discover the error, you let the journal know and you correct it. That happens frequently in our journals, at least. It's just a matter of correcting it and standing up and saying, sorry, I made a mistake, here's the right answer. And there's certainly all the journals I work for and review for have absolutely no problem with people doing that. They will publish it in an instant. In terms of mistakes, they normally lead to my best results. If you don't follow a protocol exactly, you can sometimes get better results than what you expected. And they've actually led to some changes in protocol at our institute where someone has diverted slightly from what we should do and obtained evidence that helped solve a case. So it's just a matter of documenting that mistake and making sure you know what you did. And that's what we do every day.
The one that comes to mind relates to fire management in this state and all the states of Australia. And as I mentioned earlier, when my study site burnt down, that made me think a lot about the basis and the scientific basis for fire management. And for about, probably 3 to 4 years, I was confronting authorities and saying, what's the scientific basis for what you're doing? And the initial response to what I thought were shortcomings was denial. Everything's fine. The way we manage fire is scientifically based. And so, yeah, the initial response was denial. And it taught me a lot about polite persistence in challenging the norms and saying, well, let's agree that there are some big knowledge gaps here that need addressing, and perhaps we can improve on the way in which we manage fire if we have it as a more evidence-based procedure. So I see that as a responsibility for me to challenge what I believe was a mistake, and I think has still got lots of things to improve. So unfortunately, denial was the first method of response to a scientific mistake in my area. Creativity is right up there for me. I'd have it matched, though, equally with curiosity. Those two things, to me, distinguish what a really good scientist is. I think the best scientists I've met are really curious people about just about everything. They'd be very focused people, but they need to be almost driven to understand why things are the way they are. And to find answers to that requires enormous creativity. Not accepting the status quo, not accepting necessarily the current explanation, to think of other ways of looking at things. So rather than the stereotypic view of a scientist being a boring old coot in a white coat, I think scientists are some of the most creative people I know.
I think science is profoundly creative. I'm particularly... I really want people to understand the creativity in science. And creativity is about thinking novel and interesting things. It's not about a particular piece of artwork or music or writing or performance or anything else for that matter. It's about innovative thought. And scientists are profoundly innovative. Boring scientists don't do very good science. That was a bit brave, wasn't it? But I don't think they do. I think creative scientists do exciting science, and it's elegant and exciting on its own. And yes, creativity is a core part of science. You must be creative, or else you won't be able to make those intellectual leaps that make it really satisfying and interesting.
I suppose it depends on what you define as creative. I know many scientists that are musicians or artists or, the traditional creative. I think a lot of us are creative in that we think outside the square. We're not constrained to think along the normal lines that people are. The whole field of science is about thinking on a tangent, thinking up new lines of inquiry. And in that regard, we're very creative. That's what being a researcher is. It's coming up with something that no one else has ever thought of. And it's just a different type of creative.